Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be getting started in just a moment here. But as folks get logged in, I'd love to just share some general housekeeping style announcements. You will be muted during the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A. We'll be saving time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the CA Labor Lab YouTube page. And all participants who log in today with their for the full live presentation with their registration email will get an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form directly from Zoom, and that'll qualify you for a certificate of completion with 1 continuing education contact hour. And once you submit your evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Yellen.
Thanks, Michelle. And this webinar is part of the series that the California Labor Laboratory does each month as a way of engaging the public in the issues that are central focus. And as the slide says, we are focused on emergent working conditions and their impacts for the health of the population. The laboratory is a collaboration of investigators from UCSF, UC Berkeley, California State Department of Public Health, Occupational Health Branch, with participation from UCLA and Harvard faculty. Today's lecture by Dr. Annie McClanahan of UC Irvine is entitled Sweated Labor, Gig Work, Essential Work, and the Wages of Service. And I will introduce her in a minute. Disclaimer from our funders at NIOSH about the term total worker health. Disclosure, our only disclosure is that we receive funding from NIOSH for this grant. So the mission of the California Labor Laboratory is to extend the pursuit of health and safety for workers in traditional employment to those in a wide range of alternative arrangements in partnership with the communities who would be affected by these changes. I want to alert you to same time next month, our own Carissa Harris, the director of the Center for Occupational Environmental Health and a noted ergonomics researcher, will be giving a talk on home office ergonomics, very germane to the 2/3 of California workers who do at least some, if not most, of their work from home. I want to also mention we had our first annual virtual conference last May. For those of you who attended, and for those of you who didn't, you can watch all of the lectures in our 2-day conference and by accessing it through our website. Next year, our conference will also be virtual, May 2nd to 3rd, and will be on the topic of surveillance and monitoring in contemporary employment, a very essential issue, I think, to all of us who are concerned about the way employers are monitoring our activities day by day. So before I introduce Dr. McClanahan, last week I had my first real vacation with my wife since the pandemic. We were in London. On our way out of the London Bridge Underground station, I took a picture of this ad. So we know that gig work is very prevalent. And we know that the rhetoric that sells people on why they should want to do such work is also very prevalent, but this just brought that home. And for those of you who can't read it readily, it's not that visible. Outsource the maybe next time to a freelancer who will deliver in no time. So I'm going to stop my screen share and just introduce Dr. McClanahan, who will then proceed to give the talk. We can claim her as one of our own. As you know, our center sits astride the Berkeley and UCSF campuses, and Dr. McClanahan received her PhD in English from Berkeley. And she has a unique position, in my view. When we had our annual conference on precarity of employment, the opening keynote address was given by Dr. Jacob Hacker of Yale, who described a strategy of management to shift the risks of employment to the workers by various alternative ways of hiring people. And to do that, people have to be sold a bill of goods. And so her work on rhetoric underlying gig work, only the latest in a long line of research that she's been involved in, is really essential to us to understand how it's possible that those risk shifts can occur that Jacob Hackard was describing. After she finished her PhD at Berkeley and had a fellowship at Harvard, she was a University of Wisconsin professor and is now at the University of California, Irvine, our sister campus. She's the author of a really important book on the impacts after the crash titled Dead Pledges, Dead Crisis, and 21st Century Culture was response to the economic collapse of 2008. And her is authoring another book, Tip Work, Gig Work, Micro Work, Culture, and the Wages of Service. So we're really honored that you could come today and inform us about the rhetoric underlying gig work, essential to our work as the California Labor Lab. So thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you so much, Ed and Michelle, for those really warm introductions. I'm delighted to be here. I'm particularly excited to get to be a part of a very interdisciplinary conversation. I don't always get that. And I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A about what does any of this have to do with English as a field or as a discipline. The talk that I'm going to give today is going to certainly discuss the ways in which gig work operates and some of the rhetorics behind it. It's going to tell a little bit of a longer history of gig work. And this is, again, part of an ongoing book project that's about tip work, gig work, and micro work, which is sort of digital clerical work, platform labor, it's sometimes described, and particularly the question of the method of wage payment. So the title is Gig Work, Essential Work, and the Wages of Service. Let's begin with two images. First, Elena, the essential worker, produced as part of the labor group One Fair Wages campaign to end the exclusion of tip wages from federal regulation under the FLSA. Pictured in classic Rosie the Riveter pose, fist cocked, Elena doesn't wear Rosie's factory worker blue jumpsuit, but is dressed instead in restaurant whites and a cook's apron. Unlike the Rosie of the iconic image, Elena is Black. As her bio tells us, Elena was, quote, born 30 years ago and immigrated to the United States with her family as a young girl. She is a single working mom with 2 children who are her world. She believes fiercely in creating worker power at the grassroots level and fighting for a better tomorrow for her children and all those who experience poverty, dangerous working conditions, and sub-minimum wages. So she's a kind of invented character that was used in this campaign. Second, this one. From Instacart's campaign, Beyond the Cart, a year of essential stories. In the summer of 2020, Instacart workers began to complain publicly about the fact that tips, which many customers saw as a way to help the essential workers they were asking to take a health risk for them, were being subtracted from the guaranteed wages paid by the company. In response, Instacart put together a website, quote, honoring the essential stories of 50 gig workers for the platform, almost all of them women and non-white men, as a way of encouraging users of the platform to continue to, quote, show gratitude to their shoppers. The Instacart workers highlighted in this promotional material describe being given handmade blankets, cards, and homemade pie by grateful customers. The firm itself offered these as, quote, essential heroes, the, quote, most active shoppers on the app, most of whom had made 1,000 to 3,000 deliveries in a single year during the middle of the COVID pandemic, a $200 grocery shopping credit. Between these two images, we can learn a lot about pandemic-era essential work, both the challenges workers faced and still faced, and the kinds of opposition and organizing they have attempted in response. Clearly, I have set these two sets of image against one another in part because they are ideological opposites. One is part of a relatively grassroots labor movement whose organizers are largely women of color. The other is part of a corporate apology cum marketing campaign. But I'm less interested in those obvious dichotomies. Rather, I think that taken together and despite their differences, These images tell us a lot about longer histories of service work and especially tip work. These histories bear on, but are not reducible either to the discourse of gig work as something entirely new, or to the idea that the pandemic itself represented a radical historical break in laboring conditions. One thing we notice right away is that both images focus on women, family, and domesticity. Representations of low-waged working women have long served both to secure and to disrupt hegemonic views of class and gender. On the one hand, sentimental representations of working-class industrial women in the 19th century promoted what is sometimes called a benign paternalism, in line with an essentialist ideology of gendered domesticity. On the other hand, these same images were an effort to reject the image of the white male industrial laborer as the quintessential worker, and to recenter the importance of women, not just as home workers, but also as contributors to both the household and the national economies. These two discourses came together paradoxically under the rubric of early wages and hours regulations. The case for wage regulations in the late 19th and early 20th century focused on the moral demand for adequate consumption as a precondition for reproduction. Minimum wages would guarantee that subsistence needs were met and thus would serve a larger social good by ensuring the reproduction of a healthy, vital, and moral body politic. An important Supreme Court ruling of 1908 secured states' rights to regulate women's working hours and wages, asserting that the public interest in the health of future generations, and thus the subsistence needs of women in particular, justified interfering with freedom of contract when it came to female workers. As a result of this ruling, in the 19-teens and early 1920s, many states passed minimum wage laws for women across occupations, from service workers in laundries, hotels, and restaurants, to female workers in the garment industry and other manufacturing jobs. These laws met with opposition from multiple corners, including organized labor, which, especially in the skilled professions, was suspicious of any federal infringement on collective bargaining rights. Precisely because early labor reforms had focused on women and children, organizers for labor organizations like the AFL fear that the regulation of labor would be feminizing. Meanwhile, growing fear about the centralization of state power and the quote-unquote bureaucracy that might result from a more planned economy led to a series of regressive Supreme Court decisions in the 1920s and early 1930s, including many reversals of state-based wage and hour regulations. However, in 1937, a crucial Supreme Court decision would finally provide the kind of precedent necessary to securing wage and hour regulation at the federal level. That case was Parrish versus West Coast Hotel. Elsie Parrish was a chambermaid in a Washington hotel being paid less than the state-mandated women's minimum wage. The court ruled in favor of Parrish, holding for the first time that the regulation of labor contracts did not violate the Due Process Clause and that the government could regulate the terms of labor for the public good. 6 weeks later, Roosevelt would give Congress the task of writing federal wage and hours regulation, ultimately resulting in the Fair Labor Standards Act, which passed in 1938 and set a national minimum wage of 30 cents an hour and a standard 40-hour work week. However, to secure the support of Southern Democrats eager to preserve the Jim Crow economic order, as well as Northern investors in labor-intensive sectors like service, retail, and agriculture, the FLSA ended up defining the class of workers and jobs protected by the act so narrowly that more workers were left out than were protected. The legal grounding of the FLSA ultimately turned away from the Parrish case, whose defense of the state's authority to regulate the terms of contracts was broad. Instead, it focused on a case decided 2 weeks later, NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation, a case concerning the rights of steel workers to unionize under the new National Labor Relations Act. Jones and Laughlin did not address the broader question of the public interest in regulating labor like Parrish had, and instead used the Commerce Clause to justify the constitutionality of federal labor regulations. Because the Roosevelt administration chose to rely heavily on Jones and Laughlin then, the FLSA used a uniquely narrow definition of industry. The only workers protected were those, quote, engaged in the production of goods for commerce. The act thus excluded most agricultural production, as well as virtually all jobs in the service sector, including the low-wage jobs typically held by women: laundry service, hairdressing, retail, domestic service, hotel and restaurant work. In other words, although Elsie Parrish had provided a legal precedent fundamentally necessary to the passage of the FLSA, the act itself would completely fail to provide wage or hour regulations for workers like her. The exclusion of service workers rarely occupies much space in accounts of the 1938 FLSA, probably for the same reason that it occupied very little space in congressional debates about the act. Like the legislators of the 1930s, contemporary scholars seem to assume that the very existence of the act depended on a view of commerce based on the production of goods as a matter of legal expediency. Indeed, my own review of the congressional records of the 30s suggests that considerably more time was spent debating the status of those who worked for newspapers, whose circulation blurred the lines between intrastate and interstate commerce, than was ever spent discussing the millions of retail and service workers who would be left out of wage regulations entirely. Yet I want to suggest that the exclusion of service and retail workers was not just a matter of canny legal compromise, but rather suggested an underlying producerist ideology, one tied to the racialization and feminization of service work, to its status as seemingly natural, pre-modern, pre-industrial, unrationalizable, and non-temporally disciplined, and to the immateriality of its products. We find evidence, I will suggest, for this producerist conception of service work in post-FLSA politics, discourse, and regulation, or absence thereof. We might consider, for instance, the remarkably persistent unwillingness to regulate waged domestic work, companionship labor, and home healthcare work, exclusions which outlasted the alibi about the Commerce Clause by many, many decades. But I will argue we find especially clear evidence for my claim that the failure to regulate service work was based on a feminized, racialized understanding of service as fundamentally different from goods-producing work by looking at the carve-outs for tipped workers created in 1966 and reasserted in 1996. In the decades after the Act's passage in 1938, there were a series of debates focused not just on who had a right to minimum wages and what that minimum should be, but also on the method of wage payment itself. What did wages measure in the service sector, and in what form should they be paid? Prior to industrialization, relations between domestic servants and their employers had been largely guided by customary practices that had acquired formal legal status only through long use. As a result, domestic servants of the 18th and 19th centuries were far more likely than other kinds of workers in the same period to have no protections against overwork and to receive a significant portion of their payment in kind, from lodging to leftovers. In-kind payment was seen as a solution to the unquantifiability of domestic workers' perpetual working time and also to the immeasurability of their work output. How to imagine in monetary terms the just share due to a worker whose product was a well-made bed or a precisely served meal. The liminal space that 18th and 19th century servants occupied when it came to legal regulation mirrored their exclusion from concomitant theories of waged work in political and economic thought. Because servants did not make vendable objects, they could not be conceptualized as working class. Even when service work's primary location shifted from the exclusively private space of the household to the more public spaces of hotels and restaurants, it did not seem amenable to the features of Fordist manufacturing that made the hourly wage a reasonable measure of compensation. Service work had a less measurable output, was less regularized by technologies like the assembly line, and was less likely to rely on the same kind of time discipline that helped standardize the clock punching labor of manufacturing. And here it might be interesting actually to think about that Fiverr ad, which was all about like how fast someone can do something. And I think that that question of speed and efficiency and time has always been much more complicated in the context of service work than it is in manufacturing. These issues would again be front and center in 1966, when large-scale amendments to the FLSA finally drew a wide range of service workers into wage and hours regulation. The 1966 amendments formalized a more expansive definition of commerce and narrowed or repealed many exemptions for service workers. However, the debates around how to include the restaurant and hotel industries into legislation originally written for industrial workers were fierce and complicated. As one senator put it, describing restaurant workers, quote, "Their work hours are different, and there are a great many fringe benefits in connection with their work." So here again, we see the resurgence of that idea of payment in kind as somehow like sort of intimately connected to the tradition of service work. Another discussion concerned whether restaurant workers could or should be paid an hourly wage for time spent unproductively in cleaning, washing their hands, or waiting for customers. The amendment explicitly excluded restaurant workers from hours regulations because, as a restaurant industry lobbyist put it during the mid-60s congressional debates, it is difficult to control the eating habits of patrons. So you can't have overtime protection for restaurant workers because nobody knows when a table is going to be finished with their meal. But the main issue, ostensibly, that's the claim, but the main issue was whether and how to count tips towards minimum wages. As one senator put it, in language that yokes the seemingly self-evident feminization of this work to the technical problem of how to compensate it, quote, "We recognize one thing. Certainly, a girl earns tips, but a line must be drawn at some point as to where the tips are actual earnings and where they are gratuities for extra good service." Ultimately, the 1966 legislation would draw that line by saying that tips could be counted towards half of the minimum wage, the precise amount that had been proposed by the lobbying group, the National Restaurant Association. In 1996, under further pressure from the NRA, which at the time was headed by Godfather's Pizza CEO and future presidential candidate Herman Cain, Clinton's Small Business Job Protection Act would change the tip credit wage again. No longer would the sub-minimum wage for tip workers be indexed to 50% of the prevailing minimum wage. It would instead be set at a permanent $2.13 an hour, which was 50% of the minimum wage as of 1991. But so now, rather than moving upwards as the minimum wage increased, it's set at this permanent floor of $2.13 an hour, and it's still set there today. In his objection to this piece of legislation, Anthony Kennedy wondered why an industry whose profits were on the rise should be allowed this special treatment. It's not difficult to answer Kennedy's rhetorical query. Lobbying contributions by the NRA, the other NRA, had increased by 250% between 1987 and 1996, making it one of the most powerful industry lobbies in the nation. The federal tip credit wage is now only 29% of the federal minimum wage. Only 7 states require that tipped workers be paid the state minimum wage. 26 others have established their own sub-minimum wage, but almost all set it at $5 an hour or less. As a result, tipped workers are nearly twice as likely as non-tipped workers to live under the poverty line, and more than 1 in 10 tipped workers report earning less than the federal minimum wage, even with tips. And tipped workers are also particularly vulnerable to wage theft. Women comprise 72% of all tipped workers, and tipped workers in states that use the federal sub-minimum wage experience higher rates of sexual harassment than do tipped workers in states with standard minimum wages for service workers. In states that pay the sub-minimum wage, 25% of tipped restaurant workers of color live in poverty. The setting of a sub-minimum tip wage was also a massive labor cost subsidy for the restaurant and hospitality sector. Shifting a large portion of workers' incomes to tips not only saves employers from having to pay a fair wage and the state from having to guarantee one, it also reduces the cost of managing and monitoring workers, since if one's income depends on fast, attentive, careful service, one is highly likely to oversee oneself fairly effectively. Tip wages operate as a form of workplace discipline in an industry where the regularity of standardized time discipline doesn't always obtain. The sub-minimum wage tip credit structure has also shaped contemporary app-mediated gig work, even though these workers are not covered by any labor regulations at all. Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Grubhub, Instacart, Caviar, and Postmates all provide customers a suggested tip amount of 15% to 20%, Since these companies also take a cut of around 25 to 30% of the service fee paid to the gig worker, tips are not a not insignificant portion of gig workers' income. Like restaurants, hotels, exotic dance clubs, and other establishments where tips are common, many gig companies, like Instacart, count tips toward a portion of the guaranteed wage. And often neither the workers nor the customers know exactly how that calculation is being done, because the wage formulas that calculate the relationship between the guaranteed wage paid by the app company and the tip is it's black boxed from both people in the transaction. Gig workers' reliance on tips and other forms of payment by results or piece rate makes life in the gig economy not only desperate, but also dangerous. The employment model's flexibility incentivizes potentially fatal levels of bodily risk, and did so well before the COVID pandemic. And indeed, Fiverr was famous for this other ad campaign that was basically about how great it was that they had workers who were willing to hustle by working 20-hour days. So that idea of bodily risk as being inherent to the kind of risk shift that happens in the gig economy predated the COVID pandemic by quite a bit. We find resonances between this history and the COVID era images shown here. OFW's Elena is certainly endowed with more agency than was the 19th century seamstress, whose sentimental image underwrote early labor reforms. But OFW's emphasis on Elena's maternal role and the connection the text forges between this role and her political agency does fit an older sentimental narrative around women's reproductive citizenship. The campaign's remediating evocation of Rosie the Riveter is particularly complicated in this context. The image of Elena visually evokes the iconic Westinghouse electric image created by designer J. Howard Miller in 1942 as part of the War Manpower Commission. Indeed, Elena's bio on the OFW site concludes with the fun fact that, quote, Elena is the granddaughter of Rosie the Riveter. She is boldly following her grandmother's powerful legacy of women labor leaders fighting for justice. This imagined genealogy is interesting since most World War II images of Rosie portray her as white. Miller's image, the one most clearly evoked by OFW, actually didn't become an iconic or representative image until the mid-1980s. So in the actual period of this campaign, this was not the most common image. This one wasn't common until the 80s. The far more influential version was Norman Rockwell's image from 1943 from the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, in which Rosie is more clearly an industrial worker. But the Westinghouse Rosie's popularity had an even more recent ascent than that. Beginning in spring 2020, the Westinghouse Rosie exploded in popularity as a visual figure for essential workers. And here you can see just a few examples of that. But as you probably remember, it was everywhere, particularly in the summer of 2020. This association was more than just handy iconicity or historical coincidence. The term essential work also originated with the War Manpower Commission of the 1940s. The WMC's invention of the category of the essential worker was a highly effective form of labor discipline across genders, because workers whose labor was classified as essential to the war effort were not permitted to change jobs, let alone to unionize. During the COVID pandemic, the essential worker classification likewise conscripted workers, many of them in the service sector, into continuing to work even in potentially dangerous conditions. Most of the jobs classified as essential were low-waged, had no paid leave, and were disproportionately held by workers of color. While some corporations offered temporary hero pay, that's also the language Instacart uses, raised heroes, notably not hazard pay, since they didn't want to acknowledge that there were any hazards in coming to work, classification as essential almost never led to a permanent increase in compensation for service sector workers. The category's very definition, essential to what or to whom, was intentionally vague. While, for instance, a food processing plant is arguably essential to social provisioning, it's harder to understand why a restaurant is. Pandemic-era guidance around the definition of essential worker tended to draw the boundaries even more broadly than had war-era policy. In Arizona, it included employees at golf courses. In Florida, it encompassed those employed for World Wrestling Entertainment. In this context, the category of essential work and the representation of essential workers as heroes seems entirely a kind of ideological compensation, a sentimentalizing discourse whose real effects were to forestall unionization efforts and regulatory oversight, to provide a preemptive alibi for subjecting low-wage workers of color to extremely hazardous working conditions and even death, to persuade those with the privilege to work from home that their Amazon orders really were so essential that others should be required to take on the task of fulfilling them, and to discipline a labor force that otherwise might have had unprecedented political leverage. So why then did OFW and other workers' organizations embrace the potentially disadvantageous classification of their workers as socially essential? I want to suggest that by using Rosie as a visual touchstone, OFW was trying to reject the social imaginary that would distinguish between the kinds of labor involved in producing concrete goods and the kinds of labor involved in service work, care work, and reproduction. The very same social imaginary that led to the exclusion of service workers like Elsie Parrish from labor regulation in the first place. Aligning Elena with the domestic sentimentalism associated both with 19th century women textile workers and with the industrious nationalism of Rosie the Riveter, the OFW campaign situates her in a genealogy of productive, industrial, working class female labor rather than in the tradition of feminized service work. In his work on the relationship between race, class, and gender, critical theorist Chris Chen makes a crucial argument about the relationship between the ascriptive procedures of race and gender and the wage under capitalism. Quote, "The workers' movement, with its valorization of wage labor, work, and the worker as the subject of history, failed to grasp that wage labor is not the only form of exploitation," he writes. "In fact, capitalism has proven fully compatible with unfree labor, from slavery, indentured servitude, convict leasing, and debt peonage to gendered forms of homework and unwaged reproductive labor. Indeed," he writes, "racial and gender disparities have often been, quote, reproduced as an inherent category of capitalism, not primarily through the wage, but through its absence." I want to conclude this talk by suggesting that we add to Chen's formulation about the absence of the wage the idea that race and gender are reproduced not simply through the wage, but also the way wages are paid. Here too, a discourse of productivism, what Chen calls the valorization of wage labor, shapes the language of labor reformers in ways that prevent the inclusion of service workers within the labor movement. As I have suggested, histories of the Fair Labor Standards Act rarely focus on the decades-long exclusion of service workers, nor do they address the ways in which the distinction between service work and industrial work has been both racialized and gendered. In part, this is because histories and theories of wages and wage regulation, and even labor organizations themselves, often treat the regulated hourly wage as a norm. In the opening page of Lawrence Glickman's otherwise excellent history of the fair wage movement, for instance, Glickman defines wage labor as, quote, payment to an employee based on hours or days worked. Yet there have always been multiple and disparate ways both to measure and to pay wages, many of them based not on time spent working, but rather on output or performance. My book In Progress argues that the creation of the hourly wage as both a regulatory and discursive category depended on the distinction, legal, political, and deeply ideological, between those who earn hourly wages and those who do not. In the book from which this talk is taken, I also consider the history of piece rate wages, which, like tips, are often excluded from regulation. Whereas tips were perceived as a wage form particularly effective for disciplining workers whose products were intangible or whose work could not be measured according to quantitative productivity measures, piece rate wages were perceived as a wage form particularly effective for workers of so-called substandard productivity, women, immigrants, de-skilled workers, and workers with disabilities. Hundreds of thousands of workers with disabilities are still today paid piece rate wages delinked from the federal minimum wage, while other piece rate schemes, like the Bracero agricultural program of the mid-20th century, have targeted workers on the basis of citizenship status. The perceived connection between tip work and racialized ideas about servility is both longstanding and enduring. Even after formal abolition, white Southern legislators had demanded that Black domestic workers be occupationally excluded from wage and hour regulations because the hand-me-downs and leftover food they received supposedly made up the difference between what they were actually paid and a functional living wage. This put Black domestic workers in a legal category barely better than chattel slavery. Because the history of tipping was connected to the history of domestic service, even as tipping became standard practice in the US leisure and hospitality sector, it remained the site of racial and feminized anxiety. Both giving tips and working for them was seen as degrading and un-American. A 1905 criticism of waitresses who earn tips, for instance, says, quote, "Mark the servility of the girl's attitude and her meek and lowly yes sirs and no sirs. She makes him her superior by kowtowing to him and accepting a tip. Tips and servility go together." The language of servility reflects an anxious awareness that tip work makes possible a unique form of labor discipline. The tip worker's willingness to render herself, quote, "meek and lowly" removes her from the more modern discipline of the clock, the wage, and the contract, and sets her closer to the ontological subjection of serfdom or slavery. Although tipping was much more common in the US than elsewhere, early 20th century reformers saw tipping as un-American because it encouraged anti-democratic social and class distinctions that were meant to have been left behind in Europe or in America's own pre-emancipation past. As the Orientalist term kowtow indicates, fears about tipping also reflected anxieties about the increased employment of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants in service sector jobs, ranging from domestic service to railway porters. Tipping was also commonly derided as a form of bakshish, yoking it not just to the Orientalized fear of submissiveness, but also to ethnicized anxieties about civic corruption. Because tip work was represented as a holdover from the informal dependencies of chattel slavery and historic migrant labor arrangements, it was effectively and enduringly racialized. One of the first proponents of unregulated tip wages was the Pullman Company, which operated as a monopoly owner and manager of American passenger trains. Pullman almost exclusively hired Black men from the South because, in the words of Pullman General Manager L.S. Hungerford, these men were uniquely, quote, "adapted to waiting on passengers." The president of Pullman at the time was Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Lincoln acknowledged that tipping was, quote, "an old custom, and the public seems to be fond of it." In 1915, however, the Federal Commission on Industrial Relations held hearings to investigate Pullman's practices, and they concluded that, quote, "the standard salary of the porters is such that the porters are obligated to secure tips from the public in order to live." And indeed, it turns out that Pullman actually advertised this fact in order to encourage people to tip more. So they would often say, we don't pay our porters very much, in order to ensure that people would tip them so that they didn't have to pay them very much and could still retain them. By calling on the traveling public, who were fond of tips, to ensure that the firm's workers earned a living wage, the Pullman Company was able to save on their own labor costs by using the particular affordances of tip wages, their unregulated status, their historic link to in-kind payment, and above all, the fact that they create a direct wage relation between the customer and the worker rather than mediating that relation through the firm. Here, we see an uncanny resonance with the Instacart example. After facing pushback about the way they were including tips as part of their guaranteed wages, Instacart used this campaign to describe the handmade blankets and homemade pie given to Instacart workers by grateful customers, much as employers of Black domestic workers had claimed that in-kind gifts were the equivalent of wages. Encouraging customers to reward workers with higher tips, even as they reduced the base wage they were paying by the same amount, Instacart was deploying the exact same strategy that the Pullman Company had used a century before them. The idea of servility was also connected to gender, and anti-tipping legislation was often framed as a means of protecting women against sexual impropriety. Even labor reformers were often opposed to tips for this reason. In her groundbreaking history of waitressing, the historian Dorothy Cobble quotes a progressive era reformer critical of the, quote, "relation of subservience and patronage between tip-earning women and their male customers," and an IWW activist who believed that those who relied on tips would become, quote, "servile, slavish, mealy-mouthed, and beggarly, and succumb to the easier way of loose morals." As the reference to the easier way here suggests, tip work was also associated with another pre-capitalist labor arrangement characterized by direct domination. So, in addition to chattel slavery, namely sex work. Waitressing was judged an improper trade for women, both because it required unseemly public interactions and because the exchange of tips paid directly by the customer in cash made food service appear more intimate than other kinds of work. Sociologist Frances Donovan's 1920 qualitative study, The Women Who Waits, describes working for tip wages as a form of semi-prostitution. Unable to fulfill her true desires, namely marriage and domesticity, the waitress settles for a life of unclean jokes and sex work. For Donovan, the rise of service work presaged a coming, quote, social breakdown, which would inevitably draw certain classes of workers into immorality or vulgarity as a means of survival. Unfortunately, we find echoes of this position in critics writing on service work a full century later. A number of contemporary theories of service work similarly draw on an unreflexively misogynist and anti-queer use of sex work as a metaphor for the ostensible indignities of in-person service. In Willing Slaves of Capital, Frederic Lourdun argues that, quote, prostitution has become an official trade and that as a result of the rise of service work, quote, neoliberal capital is the world of the girlfriend experience. So using prostitution as a metaphor for thinking about post-industrial labor generally. Mark Fisher likewise suggests that to understand contemporary service work, we must, quote, consider the pornographic practice of bukkake, in which, quote, men ejaculate in women's faces and the women are required to act as if they enjoy it. Carl Cederstrom's Sugar Daddy Capitalism likewise claims to discern a whole new epoch of accumulation in which the impersonality of the neoliberal state aids and abets the, quote, personalization of labor, the quote, all too human power relations, whereby, quote, the boss no longer demands just your objective time, but also wants your arse. Here again, we see the anxiety produced by a form of labor that seems disconnected from standard forms of time discipline and instead exerts a seemingly more perpetual and thus intimate form of control. It is this sense of service work as inherently feminized and racialized, and thus as inherently abject, that I think the OFW's Rosie campaign wants to resist by embracing a more familiarly industrial and also sentimental understanding of service work. However, I would briefly note that were these more traditional campaigns to consider a wider set of solidarities with, for instance, recent unionization campaigns by exotic dancers who are fighting against both subcontracting and wage calculation formulas that depend heavily on uncertain tips, it might be possible to make service work the site of a more radical set of demands. In this way, service work might cease to appear as the excluded outside of exploited labor and instead become the exemplary case of it. Service worker organizing might then allow us to reveal that traditional labor regulations in the US have been so fundamentally determined by racial and gendered exclusion and by a discourse of industrial productivism that merely including more workers under them will not be enough. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop my share here if I can find my mouse.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClanahan, for that presentation. It was a fast-moving presentation, and I want to make sure we capture all the nuggets. It's very important to have this recording to go back over because so many good points were brought out. I want to make a comment that as part of my career, I served as an expert witness in a variety of different employment and labor law cases, most of which were about the Fair Labor Standards Act and where the classification of workers was key in determining whether a person was paid overtime or not. And I remember in those days, and I worked on both sides, but I remember in those days that the definition of non-exempt work, namely work that is not protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act, talked about production work, but it was largely interpreted as work that was manual in nature, hands-on work. How does that fit in with your thesis about service work, retail work, and so on, where these kinds of jobs are basically underpaid and taken advantage of. You were talking about production work, and that can be covered by the FLSA. But what about manual work by itself? And why isn't agriculture work included there? Why isn't some other, like gig work, covered by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, one of the interesting things is that one common way in which service work is described, and particularly in kind of contemporary theories, is as immaterial. And that often gets misunderstood. What that means is that the immediate product of much service work is often immaterial, in the sense that one of the things that a server at a restaurant does, for instance, is to make you feel good, and in addition to actually bringing you your food, right, or placing your order. And I think that it's really important to understand that even when it's kind of care work, this work is very material, it's very physical, it's often very manual, but it's precisely this question that has sort of plagued the debate about these, the status of these workers all the way back in the 1930s, and particularly in the 1960s, when they did start to include more service workers under the act, but the status of workers that worked in restaurants was still really ambiguous. So for instance, one of the problems for restaurant workers is that, like, because you only earn, if you're under the sub-minimum wage, because you only really earn any money when you're actually at a table earning a tip, you're not earning money for things like rolling silverware into a napkin, or bussing the table, or setting up your station for the day, or putting on your uniform, or changing your uniform, or washing your hands, or any of these other things that they have to do. And so that's one of the reasons why the perception is that the hourly wage is based on a kind of time discipline that's specific to industry that doesn't apply as well. And the same thing, you see the same thing in gig work, right? The Uber driver is not paid while she's waiting to pick up a passenger. She's only paid for the time with a passenger in the car. And so the gig economy has sort of taken these forms of work and applied these kinds of distinctions and applied them to their labor terms as well. The agricultural example is super complicated, and I won't go into it too much, except to say that, like, it seems one of the reasons agriculture gets excluded from the beginning of the FLSA is straightforwardly as a compromise with Jim Crow, the Jim Crow economic order. Like the Southern Democrats were absolutely opposed to any labor regulations that would have applied to farm workers. But the other reason, I think, is, like, weirdly, it's sort of similar to service work, not in the sense that it's not time disciplined or that its products are not material, but in the sense that it's often treated as kind of fundamentally pre-industrial. And so even when agriculture is, like, fully industrialized, right, you have, like, it's totally on an industrial model. It's not small farms anymore. And you have the invention of big technology, combine harvesters, all of the technology that transforms agriculture in the mid-20th century. Even after that, the industry still claims that it's a different kind of labor. It's not like factory work. It can't be treated like factory work. And so in this weird way, these two kinds of work that seem completely different, right? Like working for tips in a restaurant and working for picking strawberries in a strawberry field, they seem completely different, but they actually get sort of pulled together in this categorization. And I do think that has a lot to do with the racialization and feminization of those two kinds of work as well.
Wow. Yeah. And it seems so obvious that in agriculture, the productivity of the individual workers are actually measured by how many buckets they fill and produce in a day, and just doesn't make sense. Let me just ask some questions that have come up in the Q&A. Is there anyone looking at the question of the degree to which interaction with expensive capital equipment as an expression of the investment made by the employer impacts the price of the labor that is needed to produce that work? Is there any interplay there, or do you think it's completely separate?
No, I actually think it's really related, and that's one of the things I'm trying to sort of think a lot about. So for one thing, like the question of automation and mechanization is deeply connected to both piece rate and to tips, and that's related to kind of some of what I was saying before, but it's also more complicated than that. But one of the things that people have pointed out about the connection between 19th century sweated included tenement labor, so like what we would now call sweatshops, women working for piece rate in their own homes, doing finishing on like sewing and garment manufacturing. The relationship between that and contemporary gig work is that in both cases, most of the fixed capital costs and the investment, the infrastructural investment is done by the worker, right? So the Uber driver has to pay for her car and for her car insurance and for her gasoline. And the 19th century tenement worker also had to pay for her needle and thread and her materials. And so in a way, like in addition, so it kind of comes back to that idea of the risk shift, right? So tip wages and piece rate wages both constitute a kind of risk shift onto the employee, where the employee is responsible for ensuring that she earns a living wage. And the same thing is the risk shift is also in terms of the fixed capital investment, so that these workers have to pay for their own, pay for their own like basic working materials as well, and provide the house to work in and an internet connection if you're doing platform labor. And it represents another kind of labor cost reduction for the firms.
Exactly. And to continue on the same vein, are all workers protected in the European Union or in Canada, or are there other countries that have covered these kinds of workers more effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know as much about it, nearly as much about it as I do about the American case. So I'll just say what I do know. One thing is that obviously, I mean, as anybody who's been outside the US knows, like tipping as a practice is an American, it's a distinctly American practice. It's not done. It does not constitute a form of wage payment anywhere else besides the US, which is why it's very weird that these early accounts of it are like, oh, it's un-American. But of course, it's like the most American thing that there is in terms of the restaurant sector. So tip wages do not have the same kind of status in other countries. And then the fights around the protection and regulation of gig workers, they've been much more effective in Europe, not fully effective, but much more effective. So whatever the structure of wage and hour regulations in Europe, it is clearly more capable of including subcontractors than is the way that those regulations are structured in the US.
So until the gig worker gets fair pay, it seems we should tip in cash so the employer cannot deduct from their base pay. Do you recommend that, or do
Yes.
you have? Okay.
Yes, always tip in cash. And it's actually interesting because it's becoming increasingly difficult to tip in cash. Not so much on the apps. The workers are often told not to accept cash, but I have not yet encountered one who would not. Particularly like when you are when you're going to like a coffee shop, often now it's all, particularly post-COVID, it's all done through a credit card machine. And that's a big issue. This is also an issue in places like hotels and casinos where, for instance, like bellhops or porters often were tipped exclusively in cash because they're not serving you at the site of another transaction where it can just be added on. And a lot of workers' unions, particularly in places like Vegas, are really concerned about this and how to avoid wage theft because ostensibly like the company says like, oh, well, we'll have like other workers tip you out, but that doesn't actually work all that well in practice. And so the question of like cash is like super interesting. So I've actually written about that elsewhere, is like how does a lot of this have to do with the problem of cash?
Yeah. Great answer. Another person asked the question, Dr. McClanahan's observation regarding hourly basis for paying for labor is somewhat in parallel to the process for outcomes change underway in the healthcare reimbursement. Under fee-for-service, hospitals and doctors are paid for each procedure, regardless of the outcome, versus value-based payments, where outcomes are paid for an outcome, the fewer inputs to achieve an outcome and the higher the payment. Do you have any comment about that?
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. I mean, I don't know that much. I've been trying to do a little bit of work on healthcare and on the healthcare sector, and particularly on the ways in which, like automation and even the paperwork systems are impacting these questions around wage payment. I don't know very much about it, but I think that's an excellent analogy, and really, it's worth looking into. I'm grateful.
Good. And what do you see is the relation between raising restaurant workers' salaries and the prices of dining? I know that has been an argument, which is, well, if we have to pay our people more, then you have to pay more for your meals.
Mhm.
Is that a strong argument for not increasing the $2.13 minimum that people are offered?
Yeah, so One Fair Wage actually has like some really great data on this question, suggesting that we actually have a fairly good kind of natural experiment there, because there are these states that use 7 states, including California, that use the federal minimum wage, and they have suggested that there's not really discernible differences if you look across. I mean, obviously prices are different in California than they are in Arkansas, but like broadly speaking, that there are not discernible differences. And of course, we also know that like that justification, that you can see that in debates about the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 with respect to manufactured goods, right? That's a fairly old claim, a familiar claim. And it's one that I think is worth being pretty skeptical about. I don't think that there's a ton of evidence for it, though, of course, if you're an economist, it's like when I took some econ classes a few years ago, and it was like Econ 101 is like minimum wage laws are bad in general because they raise prices for consumers. So it's a question of debate, but it's not one that I think is all that complicated to answer.
Is the NRA pushing that as an
Oh yeah, I mean the NRA, yeah, I mean the NRA is really quite something. The history of it is really fascinating. But yeah, they are very in favor of keeping the tipped credit wage. And during the Trump administration, there was actually all of this conversation about like tip pooling and allowing the employer all the tips to go through the employer, which would then distribute them. And there was a kind of alibi for that was like, oh, it's better for people like back of the house workers, like dishwashers, et cetera, because then they get a little share of the tips. But the main sense was that because the NRA had been supporting that change in the legislation that was sort of being floated by Trump, the sense was that employers were going to use it as an opportunity for wage theft. So almost always when you have tip pooling, employers use it as a chance to skim off the top some of the wages, some of the tips, rather than distributing them.
Mm-hmm. That's great to know. Is there new legislation in the works to raise servers' base pay? It's just incredible that, it's at $2.13 since what year?
Yeah, 1994. Yeah, so well, in 1966, since it's been 50%, and then 1994, since it's been $2.13. Yeah, I mean, One Fair Wage has been working on this for a long time. They were part of the Fight for 15 campaign, which is obviously still ongoing, unfortunately not yet successful. And there are a lot of groups really working on this a lot. One of the things I find slightly disappointing is that the exotic dancers unions actually were working to try to be included they were working through the AB5 campaign to be included as part of the sort of question around subcontracting, and to include more so-called subcontracted workers under labor protections, the same way that we should include Uber drivers. One Fair Wage and the Fight for 15 groups have not done as well at including people like workers for exotic dance clubs, and I wish that they would. But there are very strong movements particularly about restaurant workers and many of those are going through One Fair Wage and its campaigns.
Okay, and so we're trying to work towards fair pay, and really what's important here is that we want to work towards all people covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Do you see any time in the future that all workers would be covered by it?
I think it really has to be fundamentally reconceived. I think that these distinctions are so embedded in it. And I mean, we can think about the subcontracting example as one of them. And every time that you create these kinds of forms, companies and sectors will find a loophole, the exact same way that the gig companies found a loophole in the definition of employee under the sort of regulations for subcontractors. And so I think we really I don't think that like merely expanding the existing law is enough. I think it has to be much, 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 much broader than that.
Well, that's a great final answer. We loved your talk. And now we had many questions here that we couldn't get to, and I apologize, but let me turn it over to Dr. Yellen.
Well, I just want to say that I hope this is the beginning of a relationship between California Labor Lab and humanities professors like yourself, and because you have much to teach us about how the rhetoric that underlies a lot of the movements within the labor market, legitimate things that ought not be happening. So on behalf of the California Labor Lab and the many positive comments that we see popping up on our screen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I feel really honored to be here, and I'm really grateful for the chance to have this kind of cross-disciplinary conversation.
Great.